remember in my childhood how much those sorts of broken promises mattered to me. They were very casually, made and broken. So yeah, those are, if you like, very small spiritual wounds, but I remember them in my adulthood as broken promises that my parents failed to fulfill. So, how much more resonant and meaningful is it when, you have a promise on the national level? South Africa's promise to reform itself, to deliver a new life for its citizens. There are very few people now who feel that South Africa's lived up to that promise. Yet in 1994, at the time of our first democratic elections, there was a heady, giddy sense of renewal and possibility, and the possibly very naive belief that we could carry this out, we could remake our futures. It has not come to pass. I'm not sure what the promise of Israel is or might be, but politicians are always making promises and breaking them. And I'm not even sure that we can attach a spiritual value to those kinds of promises anymore. They're that worthless.
And there's a certain sense in which that comes out in the book. There's a line that I still remember where the rabbi who's officiating one of the funerals says that the internal family conflict has not troubled him and given him as much moral turpitude as the question of the formation of Israel. And there are ways in which there's a sense of course, a broken promise that runs through the book and a sort of serious narrative that runs through the book. But it's not a very serious book in between all of these promises. At parts, it's hilariously funny. I remember reading it over the course of the New Year's and I was laughing out loud. It's dry, witty humor. It's people navigating the bureaucracy of death. It's people navigating life in incredibly changed circumstances. What did it mean to sort of write these narratives that kind of reflect upon a scenario that might be very dull, dry, and serious, but actually plays out in very different ways? And do you think the setting that you've found for it, the story of a single family, allows you to bring that out more effectively than other forms?
I'm not sure if it's the family. I mean, I just think human life generally, life's a serious business, and yet it's very funny. Human endeavors and struggles are very amusing. I'm very fond of the way Samuel Beckett described Waiting for Godot as a tragicomedy, because I think human life is a tragicomedy. It's desperately sad, but at the same time, there's always something to laugh at. And without that, many human situations would be utterly intolerable. I'm very glad you found the book funny, because some readers are apparently tone deaf to the irony of it. And without that irony, I would not have been able to write the book, and I think it would be a very bleak experience to read it, honestly. The raw material of, broken promises, but also the funerals, the fact of death, which happens to be, the end of our individual journeys through time. All of us are going to end up with a funeral one day, if we're lucky, I guess. That's dark, bleak material. And yet the book's not about death, it's about what we do before that. It's about human life, and human life is very funny. People are very funny. So yeah, I mean, I think what makes life endurable is the fact that there's always something. If you pay close enough attention, there's always something that will amuse you. And the situations that are truly, on a human level, not bearable are those where that possibility ceases to exist.
I want to pick up on one thing that you said, because I think it really underscores the conversation we've been having as well, which is around the readers responding to the book. You're not writing for the reader. Who are you writing for?
I mean, I don't know. You are ultimately writing for a reader because, you close the circle by sending your book out into the world where hopefully it's received and read. But I never think about that endpoint in the writing. I suppose in some abstract way I'm thinking, I'm writing for somebody like me who has my tastes and perhaps my values and would like the sort of writing that I aspire to produce. So in a certain sense, I'm writing for myself, but that self is out there, hopefully refracted into, you know, a multitude of other readers, or even a handful of them, whoever they may be.
And tell us a little more, Damon, that over the course of this novel, you see 4 funerals, a broken promise, but you also see a certain refusal to fall on one side or another. You have characters that animate the book. You have characters that bring out very stark realities. There are, you know, the characters of Salome's son, who's outraged at what is happening and who is almost dismissive at the prospect of a white South African fulfilling a promise that was never hers to keep because the land was again stolen from those who lived in the country earlier. Do you see a certain sort of moral arc hovering over the book? Or are you uninterested in that kind of reading of the book?
You know, in keeping with what I was trying to express earlier, that I try to push, you know, the novels I write to resemble life as I know it, means that the kind of novel that a lot of readers maybe are looking for, the kind that rewards good people or good actions and punishes bad ones, doesn't necessarily apply. I mean, I understand the gratifications that a novel like that can deliver. I've read lots of them myself, where you get exercised over a moral question, and then the moral question is resolved, and, you know, appropriate punishments and rewards are given. How does that resemble what I read in the newspaper every day, where, you know, terrible dictators die peacefully in their sleep in old age? Good people are often not rewarded or even recognized. But you've got a literary problem if you try to paint the world in those accurate terms. The literary problem being that the book does not deliver the satisfactions that a reader might want from it. Even the very form of a novel, the fact that you have a problem which needs a resolution, how many real resolutions does the world offer? Most of the time it's a patchwork compromise at best. Between the covers of a book, this is not satisfying to most readers. You want to honor the unities, maybe, that Aristotle once articulated. So I try to get as close to that as possible. So there is at least one character in this moral morass who does have impulses towards the good, and that's Amor, who's the youngest daughter. And she's the person who, in a very imperfect way, finally sees this promise through. And yet, the house is a horrible house on a broken piece of land. The resolution is not a satisfactory one. And Amor herself is open to all kinds of moral challenges. And in fact, those are articulated by Lucas, Salome's son, in the book, where he speaks for a new generation in South Africa with a very, very angry voice. When he says to her, you know, the house already belongs to us. Not only this house, but your house, the house your family lives in. I don't have to ask for it. It's already mine. There are a lot of young South Africans who feel exactly that way, and I understand why. So in a funny way, I see it as a balancing act, if you like, between the expectations of the novel and my desire to represent the workings of the real world, and to deliver perhaps on both levels. I mean, it's a very challenging thing to get right, and perhaps I haven't succeeded with all readers, but that's my aspiration.
But I think you draw upon something important, right? Like, what is the work of fiction today? As you said, you cannot offer a moral arc that's very easy because your newspapers are telling you a completely different story. But at the same time, you see, and this is a narrative that I like particularly in the book, where apartheid is over, the Springboks are playing their first international game, and all of South Africa is cheering on a team led by Nelson Mandela, a black man who not too long ago was in prison, and a white South African family is watching this and okay with this black man on stage because, hey, we're playing international sport again. And in the grand scheme of things, you just realize that apartheid is over, and it's not made that much of a difference. And you just suddenly realize the smallness of a moment that seems so pivotal, so grand. Does that leave you almost where does that leave you to know that even something that dramatic?
Well, you know, I mean, for its time, that moment was real. You know, in the 90s, when Nelson Mandela became president, I mean, and I have to emphasize, this was unthinkable. When I was growing up, there was no way Nelson Mandela would come out of jail, the Communist Party, the ANC would be unbanned, we would have, you know, open democratic elections. Never going to happen. And yet it happened seemingly overnight. And in a funny way also, I think because we had lived in a kind of a test tube in South Africa, real life, real political events were sealed off. We were under boycott and sanctions and being fed a daily diet of propaganda. We had no real sense of how brutal actual politics are. And we did believe, as I say naively, that we could remake ourselves, remake the world, and nothing captured that moment more than our World Cup win. You know, exactly the events you're describing, which is why I selected that to define the second section of the book. Yeah, looking back at it now, it's absurd. You know, the hope embodied in that moment seems unbelievably inadequate, thin. Yet at the time it was real. That was what we thought was going to happen. And in a different sort of book, maybe that would be your triumphal, climactic moment. But as I say, I have tried to work against presenting the world in those terms because it doesn't actually work that way. And the South African story has certainly not worked that way.
And it's been done before. You know, I remember before I met most South Africans, my only access to post-apartheid South Africa was a wonderful movie which I loved at the time but don't love anymore, Invictus, which ends with this massive bonhomie with black and white South Africa coming together and a perfect picture of the post-apartheid rainbow nation coming together in peace. And you shatter that. Well, almost directly.
Well, real life has shattered that too. I mean, you know, movies work on that kind of feel-good, exercising your emotions. And of course there's a sort of catharsis that takes place, but is it real? Not in my perception.
If race is, and this is going to be my last question before we open it up to wonderful audience questions, if race is the sort of defining feature that governs these four broken promises, what is the sort of organizing principle that towards the end of the book you see is governing what broken promises will mean by the fifth funeral? I say this particularly because you're seeing a South Africa today that is increasingly unsafe. You have a murder in the book, which is not a murder driven primarily by race, but by drugs and poverty and a certain sense of crime being acceptable. You're seeing a transformation in which, if the structures of apartheid didn't exist, their sort of remnants continue to roam around in a South Africa that doesn't understand what the central problem anymore is. And it might as well be race. So what do you think governs the sort of interpersonal relationships and the complex ties that hold this country together right now and the years to come?
I mean, the fundamental problem we're living with is that apartheid is over, and yet it isn't. I guess you could say political power has been handed over in South Africa, but economic power has not. And economic power defines people's lives. So, you know, people who were poor, dispossessed before, are still mostly poor and dispossessed. And people who had money, resources, and access to power are still in the same position. Unfortunately, those divisions are defined by race because that's how the apartheid system was set up. Now, theoretically, you know, the gates have been thrown open, anyone can change their lives, and some people have, to be fair. You know, the middle class, black middle class has grown, it's larger than the white middle class, but it's still, relative to the overall population, very small. So we sit with the same situation. I happen to think that South Africa's new issues are not race, they're class. But because class lines, class divisions still follow racial divisions so closely, it's very easy to confuse the two. But there is a small elite black superclass, and then, as I say, a middle class. People mix within the limits of their own class. What doesn't happen is, people mixing. Middle class people don't hang out with working class people. It doesn't happen anywhere. But because that division is still racial in South Africa, it takes on an almost existential sense of crisis, a sense of crisis we're living with right now.
Thank you very, very much, Damon. And I think on that note, we're going to move on. A loud round of applause for Damon, please, for being such an incredible person to discuss a wonderful novel with. We have around 10 minutes for audience questions. The lovely gentleman in the first row.
Hello. Hi, Mr. Galgut. You spoke about how you wrote a screenplay and that changed how you were looking at the novel. Of course, even before you wrote The Promise, you were a renowned author, and as an author, you've always been transporting readers into a visual world and the perspective from which to see things at. So what particularly about the language of cinema and screenplay writing made the difference for you when you were writing The Promise? Because I'm assuming you were doing it already. In terms of how you were saying visually this is what is happening in terms of transporting the person. But what about the lexicon of cinema and the language of cinema helped you specifically for Promise, and how that changed how you approach this technically as a writer?
Cinema is visual, so the camera can take you very, very close to somebody's face, but it can't really take you inside their head. But the story is told entirely visually. I love movies. I watch a movie almost every day if I can. And also, I guess with my theatrical background, that sort of visual language is very appealing. But I happen to think that the novel reached its height under modernism. People like William Faulkner or Virginia Woolf, who were playing not only with the passage of time, but with different voices. And that, I guess, became possible for me with this book once I adopted the cinematic language of changing perspective continually and leaping around in time and outlook. But I could take it a little bit further, because with a novel you can go into somebody's head. You can describe their thoughts, but then you can cut, as it were, from that internal perspective to a physical description, or maybe the way somebody else in that same scene is perceiving it very differently at that exact moment. So I'm sorry if that's not a full answer to your question, but I would say the ability to rapidly, immediately cut, as it were, from one perspective to another was what excited me in terms of that cinematic approach.
Thank you so much.
Other questions? In the second row there. Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
I have found that apartheid is the central theme in your some of books. I have noticed that the main character is apartheid. Can you comment on that, please?
I really dislike what might be called a political novel, where everything is reduced to the power play of particular groups or particular people. So I've actively tried not to write about apartheid, to be honest with you. In fact, I don't think you'll find the word apartheid in any of my books. But of course, apartheid creates a world with its own bizarre upside-down laws and a very inverted, distorted morality. And that world is the one I've grown up in. It's one I still inhabit to some degree in South Africa. So I'm writing about what I know. But what I know, just as what everybody here knows, is shaped by my historical moment. We're all products of our time and place. But stories ultimately are about people who happen to be living in that time and place. So I hope that my attention is always on the humans and less on the history, which I try to keep in the backdrop.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman at the back there, who's standing up now.
In South Africa, political freedom has been attained. Still, they are not economically free. So what's wrong in the country? What kind of system, economic system they are following? It is capitalism or socialism?
No, it's very clearly capitalism, which is one of the mysteries of South Africa, because I think the ANC as a resistance movement was always based on socialist principles. It was one of the great fears sold to white South Africa that if we give in and black people take over the running of this country, we're going to be communist. And communism is godless. You know, apartheid was very dominated by a severe form of Calvinist Christianity. And we saw it or we were told it was our spiritual duty to defend South Africa, but also the Western world against communism. It was part of the Cold War mentality. But in the years leading up to 94, with the democratic elections, something changed on the side of the ANC. I think it was probably Thabo Mbeki who was the engineer of that switch. But no, the ANC, when it took over, basically signed up to, well, precisely the way we had been living. So yeah, it's capitalism run riot. And we've lost the moment, unfortunately, because I think there was real goodwill for a while. White people would have been prepared to give up far more than they are prepared to give up now, back in the 90s, if there had been some kind of socialist program to bring people onto a more equal footing. But unfortunately, I think officially, we do have the largest inequality gap in the world between rich and poor, which accounts for almost every travail that we're going through right now.
The lady at the back there in the green. You can go ahead.
Hi, Damon, huge fan. I was so happy The Promise won.
Thanks.
During the talk, you spoke about writing for your kind of reader, like with someone who has your tastes. So what are your favorite novels? I'd love to know.
Well, I have quite eclectic tastes, to be fair. But, you know, I mentioned the modernist moment as being what I think of as the height of the novel. So writers like William Faulkner, Samuel Beckett, Virginia Woolf, I think are wonderful. They're a high water mark on a literary level. More recently, a writer like W.G. Sebald, a German writer. Patrick White, Australian writer, much neglected these days, but a towering figure for me. You know, books that are prepared to take risks. You know, even the extreme risk of failing. Books that were prepared to break the form of the novel. It's not a risk that's favored these days because books are perceived to be so much under threat from the series, the streaming series more than anything, or from social media, seem to set up a challenge which I think is a false one. A lot of publishers think books should be competing, if you like, with social media or with series. And I think you've lost before you begin. I think books should fall back on their core strengths, which, you know, rely primarily on language and what language can do. And, you know, the sort of risks that might have been possible 40, 50 years ago are just not even considered an option by most publishers. And the writers I've mentioned, Beckett, Virginia Woolf, Faulkner, I'm not sure they would actually get published now if they submitted their novels. I think they'd be considered too much of a risk, which is, you know, I can't prove that, but that's my sense, and I feel really sad about that.
Any other questions? The lady there on that side of the room with the sunglasses. If you can get a mic to her. If you can just stand up, yes. The mic should reach you somehow.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about your choice of using the family unit rather than another group like colleagues or a group of friends. How central was this choice of a family unit to demonstrate change or just tell your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was quite central, but I'm not even sure I could define to you why, because almost everything else I've written has centered much more on a solitary individual, the kind of individual who might have been damaged by growing up in a family like this. You know, I grew up in a very dysfunctional family, and I suppose I wanted to, as I said, I think there are very strong connections between what happens in the state and what happens in the family. So I wanted to trace those connections. But you could also, with a tightly bound group, who, you know, the thing about a family is you've got them, you can't really leave. These are people you have to deal with, whose views you have to accommodate or reject, but you know, you don't easily leave a family behind. So it allowed me, I think, to put in very different perspectives. So in some way, I think each member of the family that I've dealt with embodies a different aspect, if you like, of white South African thinking. I mean, the middle daughter is someone who's entirely hedonistically caught up with herself, isn't even interested in larger moral questions. The older son is someone of my generation for whom apartheid was created. Without any effort on his part, all the fruits of the world were presented to him just by virtue of being white and male. And the youngest daughter, as I say, has a moral impulse, and there are, of course, such people in South Africa, but she's not able to act in a clean, exemplary way on that impulse. So, yeah, it allowed me to look at really what I've encountered and processed of the white South African milieu that unfortunately is my world and the one that shaped me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Damon. And for those of you who haven't picked this up, this is a book that I could not put down, literally unputdownable, and as I told you earlier, read in a day. It's a moving tale that really also shows the power of fiction. Thank you once again, Damon, for such a wonderful session. Another loud round of applause for him, please.
Thanks,
he will be
Anish,
available
and
to sign
thank you
the
to the
books.
audience. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, Damon, and thank you, Anish. So, he's very happy signing the books. Books are available, and he'll be able to sign them at the designated signing desk and also at the Crossword bookstore.